Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report, a monthly public policy forum co-sponsored by the George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University. I'm Marvin Kalb, the Executive Director of the Washington office of the Shorenstein Center. This past year, as many of you may know, our overall theme has been journalism at the crossroads. Tonight, not a title, not a headline, but certain names run through my mind. Those names will determine our questions, and I'm sure the answers as well. Daniel Pearl, Terrorism; Ted Koppel, David Letterman, Nightline, CBS, ABC. Daniel Pearl was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. He was brutally, savagely murdered by terrorists, probably Pakistani. Why? Perhaps because his killers wanted to murder an American who happened to be Jewish. Perhaps because he was a journalist. Perhaps because they wanted to disrupt the pro-American anti-terrorist position taken by their president. How will this now affect the coverage of terrorism? Our second major topic tonight, profit in TV news. How much is enough? Enough to dump a program such as Nightline, enough to humiliate an anchor such as Koppel, enough to go public with a negotiation for David Letterman's comic talent. How much is enough? Our panelists are all excellent journalists who approach the Pearl-Koppel questions from different perspectives. To my left, Steve Roberts, the J.B. and Maurice C. Shapiro Professor of Media and Public Affairs. He's been a journalist for more than 35 years, working for the New York Times, U.S. News and World Report, and the New York Daily News. He has taught at the George Washington University for 11 years and is a prolific writer. To my right, Nicholas Tatro, Deputy International Editor of the Associated Press, probably the most distinguished, the best news agency in the world, at least I think so. Tatro joined the AP in 1971. He covered the Middle East extensively, based in Cairo, Beirut, and Jerusalem. Ann Cooper is Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, a job she's held since July 1998. She's worked as a foreign correspondent for National Public Radio, based in Moscow and then Johannesburg. She's taught radio and international reporting at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. Cokie Roberts is the other half of the Roberts team tonight. She is co-anchor of ABC's This Week with Sam Donaldson and Cokie Roberts. She's also chief congressional analyst for ABC News and continues to work for NPR. Cokie and Steve Roberts write a weekly syndicated column. They also authored a book called From This Day Forward, their story of their 30-plus years of married life. Peter Mayer is the White House correspondent for CBS Radio News, a job he has held for the last 16 years. He loves politics. He's covered every political convention, election night, and presidential inauguration since 1980. I think that's right. He's won many journalism awards. He flies frequently on Air Force One with the president, but in truth, he doesn't get any frequent flyer points. And E.J. Dionne Jr., a columnist for the Washington Post since 1993. He also spent 13 years with the New York Times, was a foreign correspondent, and he is now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Like Roberts, he too is a prolific writer, going from columns to books, and he appears frequently on NPR. Okay, let us start with the Daniel Pearl story, which ended so tragically. Pearl was the 9th reporter to be killed in this war, the first, though, killed because he was a reporter. Last year, 37 reporters were killed worldwide. The worst year, I'm told, was 1994, when 72 reporters were killed. The Associated Press has lost 26 reporters in its 150-year history. Now, I'm told that the AP has very specific guidelines for war coverage. Are you in a position to share those with us?
Well, I wouldn't want to go into any specific detail, but in general, I think these come in three parts. The first part is a sort of common sense guideline that you shouldn't go anywhere alone, that you should work with your colleagues. We're a multimedia company. We have television, we have still photography, we have broadcast radio. Usually we work in groups, and that our people need to stay in frequent contact with and check off their decisions with their managers, whether it be New York or wherever. And
so if they wanted to go somewhere, they would, if it was a questionable area, they would have to check in with New York first.
Well, they would check in with their managers. They might be in Islamabad or Vienna, or for bigger decisions, it might go further to New York or Washington. Another thing we do, and I think this is crucial, is we send so far over 400 of our people to a special security course where they're exposed to things like where to stand, not to stand in a riot. They're shown that bullets go through car doors, and they get some training in first aid, how to deal in a war situation, and they're put under stress to give them a sense of that. So, and thirdly, we have compiled the remembrances and tips and advice of people who've worked in dangerous places and published a book on the subject.
Ed Cooper, everybody now knows, because it's come out, that Pearl was Jewish because his captors forced him to say that he was Jewish, his mother was Jewish, his father was Jewish, and it seems clear that his captors wanted that religious association to be known because they took pictures of that final moment. If you were an AP editor now, would it be a problem for you to send a Jewish reporter to an Arab or Muslim country to cover the story, knowing that there was violence there?
Well, I don't want to be in a position of making editorial judgments for news organizations. That is still very much up to them. I think it's something that many editors are thinking about, but it's a decision that they have to make based on what they know of the circumstances. I know this has come up a lot because of the Danny Pearl case, but Marvin, as you correctly pointed out at the beginning, we don't know, first of all, why these people took Danny Pearl specifically, and we don't know why they killed him. What I think you can say, he was killed because he was a journalist, because he certainly wouldn't have been in Pakistan if he were not a journalist, right, and doing that reporting that led to him being captured. But was the point that he was American, journalist, Jewish? Some people have suggested he may have been a target because of Wall Street Journal editorials. Who knows at this point? And so I don't think that, given the degree of uncertainty, that you just turn your editorial policies or your editorial judgments around.
Steve, would the issue, or should the issue of the religion of a reporter now be a factor in whether you send a reporter to cover Pakistan, for example?
First, let me say that any reporter who works for the AP is under stress every day. They don't have to learn it, and of course. It is a very serious issue. When I worked for the New York Times based in Athens, in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War in the mid-'70s, the New York Times made a specific decision not to send Jewish correspondents into Beirut because it was such a uncertain situation. And as a Jewish person myself, it meant that they would not send me into Beirut, and in fact our correspondents in Rome and London were also Jewish, and there was one poor Irish Catholic in Tehran who got sent into Beirut constantly, but it was a serious issue. The first time I ever saw Israel was riding on a bus driven by an al-Fatah guerrilla through the barbed wire from the Lebanese side of the border into Israel. That was not a particularly comfortable moment for me, and I do think that this reminds us that while you like to think that journalists are professionals and they're immune from retribution or targeting because of their religion or nationality or ethnicity, the truth is you do have to be careful, and there is a history here, and the Times did make that decision at that time.
The Times, if I'm not mistaken, also did not send Jewish reporters into Israel for a totally different reason.
That is true, Marvin. For many, many years there were no Jewish reporters in Israel because there was a feeling that the New York Times was a Jewish-owned newspaper. The family who owned it was Jewish, and there was a concern that they wanted to avoid any appearance of favoritism. There is a famous story that Abe Rosenthal, your old friend who was Jewish and who was the editor, wanted to break this taboo and decided to send David Shipler, a very distinguished New York Times correspondent to Israel. The Israeli intelligence was much better than Abe Rosenthal's because, as the story goes, Abe was very excited. He went up to the ambassador of Israel and said, "Mr. Ambassador, very good news." And before he could say anything more, the ambassador said, "Abe, David Shipler is a Methodist." So he thought his wife was Jewish.
Peter Mayer.
Let me say, as we sit here tonight, the administration, to the best of my knowledge, the people in the National Security Council and other areas, intelligence areas, don't know whether Daniel Pearl was killed whether he was grabbed because he was Jewish. We know, as we've mentioned already, given the brutality of this tape, that they certainly took advantage of that fact, perhaps to inflame some of their hardline followers even more. We do know, according to administration officials, that their goal from the start was to kill an American reporter. A top official told me today that even if the U.S. had somehow seen its way to change the long-standing and I think correct policy not to negotiate with kidnappers, that there's nothing in the world that could have been done to save Daniel Pearl's life, that he was marked for execution from the get-go, from the moment that they started plotting his kidnapping. For whatever reason he was the target, he was going to be killed.
Koki and EJ, to elevate you even beyond where you already are, and you run a network, you run a newspaper, how would this affect you in terms of the assignment of reporters to war zones now?
Look, it would affect me by running as far as I possibly could the other direction. And when Steve was occasionally in dangerous situations, I basically wanted him to run as far as possible in the other direction. But I think it's important, and Ann can speak to this a great deal better than I can, to understand that there are reporters in danger all day, every day, because they are reporters. And it's not because they're going into war zones, it's because they're covering the country they live in. And every year when we have the International Women's Media Foundation lunch where we honor these incredible women, I am so humbled by what they have gone through. They have been beaten up, they've been raped, they've had horrendous things happen to their life and property and their families. Because they are reporters, they're just trying to tell the truth about the regime in which they live. And they are very, very, very brave people. Whoa. And no credential is going to protect them from the incredible danger that they put themselves in just by trying to be truth tellers.
I absolutely agree. I'm trying to say that in the post-9/11 environment, and with the example of Daniel Pearl, where he was deliberately targeted, apparently. Anyway, he's dead at this point. How, as an editor of a major newspaper, are you, EJ, to handle assignments of this sort? Should what happened to Pearl affect your judgment in any way?
I mean, as a human being, yes, and as an editor, no. And I suppose I don't want to consign editors to the role of not being human beings in saying that.
Feel that way about
But I think that, but I do think there is I think there's a difficult judgment to make, because clearly, if you are an editor, you do not want to put your folks in unnecessary danger. Therefore, you might make the decision Steve talked about to say, we don't want to send a Jewish reporter into this situation. Presumably, we might not want to send another kind of reporter into another situation. Yet there is something deeply wrong about...
Although you were a Catholic to the Vatican, and that was extremely dangerous.
Right, exactly. That's, and Koki was there for some of the time. But that's a good case in point, where there is something fundamentally wrong saying an American Jew can't cover Israel, that somehow automatically he or she is going to be suspect, or that a Catholic can't cover the Vatican, or an Irish Catholic or Protestant can't cover Northern Ireland. And it's in a country that prides itself on pluralism and tolerance and openness. You don't want that situation to prevail. And so therefore, in principle, you don't want to say that because this horrible thing happened to Daniel Pearl, never again would a news outlet send somebody who is Jewish into that situation. Yet, if you are the editor, you're going to think about your reporter. I will always love an editor at the New York Times called Bill Borders. When I first went into Beirut, and it was the first time I had ever covered war, I was about to go cover a piece of the war which he thought was very dangerous. And he called me up on the phone and said, you are at your most dangerous stage. You have been there long enough to think you know what you're doing, and you're too stupid to know that you don't really know what you're doing. And he forbade me from taking a particular trip on sort of the AP rules. And I will always feel grateful to him for making that decision. And as time went on, I don't know if I was any less stupid, but I was able to do more. So you value an editor who protects an individual human life, and yet you don't want to make policies based on giving in to other people's prejudices.
Nick, you are an editor. You do international coverage. You sit in New York and have under your authority an awful lot of AP reporters all over the world. What kind of considerations, if any, now enter your calculations in, 1, post 9/11, 2, post Annie Pearl?
Well, I think that, when we're looking at, say, the Afghan war, or we're looking at Colombia, or we're looking at any of these hotspots, we like to talk it over with our people and get a sense of what they think, and test. Sometimes people will feel they have to go somewhere, or they'll volunteer for something, and when you talk to them, you can either really define their mission and try to get them through the process of talking it over to set the limits, and to or will decide on a strategy on how to approach a particularly dangerous area. We'll talk over the roads in a particular area of Afghanistan and what other people's experience are, and we'll check our other departments and see what they hear. So there's a consultative process that goes on, and it's taken on an individual basis. And I don't think we're making any overarching rules for any particular area. We're just trying to work out a process of dialogue with people and see what is an acceptable risk.
I know for a fact that the Wall Street Journal is now, post Annie Pearl, considering very carefully whether to send a Jewish reporter into that area. And the tendency right now is to say no. Has a problem like that ever arisen for you at the AP?
Well, I don't want to put it in the context of the particular case with Danny Pearl, but I think we thrive on our diversity, and say the Middle East, covering the Middle East story. We have Palestinians, we have Israelis, we have Americans, Canadians, we have at least one German staffer, and it's a real mix, and out of that you can get different views and different backgrounds brought to bear, and I think we all benefit from that. So I think it's our way of life.
And
every newsroom that has foreign correspondents is talking about all of these issues right now.
Yes.
And I think what you're hearing is it's very hard to write a policy like that. There may be a decision made in an individual case. The next person who's going into Pakistan, if you have 2 or 3 choices, you know, maybe someone will make that choice based on, you know, what's just happened. But there really aren't that many things that you can set in stone as policy. There are not many concrete things you can do except to try to be aware and to talk to your reporters, as Bill Borders did with EJ. You know, you want to make sure that people have proper equipment in the field. In some stories, that means giving them an armored car of some sort and bulletproof vests and that sort of thing. The training that Nick was talking about, it's called hostile environment training. Some journalists have said that's very helpful, and I think, you know, organizations like AP are now doing it on a routine basis. You've got so many people going into these dangerous zones. But, you know, there are journalists who have been through the training and have ended up dead on the job anyway. There was a case of a BBC correspondent a year or so ago whose driver was killed, and you know, the correspondent said later, we'd all been through the training, but in fact the only thing that would have helped that day would have been for us to just stay home.
But I also have a question, which is, these are such individual decisions, and one of the things that was so interesting about Danny Pearl was a lot of the stories about him as a person said he wasn't a cowboy. Do you say, when you're looking at, it's not necessarily ethnicity or religion, do you say this guy just wants the glamour a little too much, he's too dangerous, he's too willing to go into situations where he's just going to hurt himself?
Well, I think that's why you have a dialogue. I mean, you want to find out if somebody is trying to take on too much. And, you know, I think there was a certain, 20 years ago in Beirut or whatever, there was a certain freedom that reporters took or had, and I don't remember doing a lot of consulting about what we were going to do in Beirut and so forth. So I think that that's what's changed.
I've got to wonder how much dialogue, Nick, can help. I have to be honest, I've never covered a war, but I have been, to paraphrase a column by Nicholas Christov in the Times last week, have been in many situations where you find yourself going in somewhere and everybody else is headed in the other direction, you know, several times domestically and overseas, and you find yourself in these situations and you find a blur of adrenaline, of trying to think about protecting yourself, but it's all colored by your overriding goal to get the story.
You know,
and go ahead, Steve.
There's another factor which we haven't touched on, and I in no way want to imply that official government policy is in any way related or responsible for Danny Pearl's death. But covering this war is very difficult. The Pentagon has made it very difficult to give us access as journalists to the war zone. The rules are very restrictive. There are some people who think that these are the most restrictive rules in 30, 40 years that we've operated under. And it makes risk-taking more necessary when you do not have the access to the battlefields through government channels. And the fact is that you talked about some journalists who were killed going into Afghanistan earlier, and they were killed because they came in on their own and there was no provision for government help. And as I say, I don't in any way want to say that Danny Pearl was taking risks because the government was responsible, but I do think that you have to include as part of your analysis here a government policy which is deliberately and consciously dictated by an attempt to withhold information from journalists, and it makes our job a great deal harder and at times a great deal more dangerous.
Absolutely, and accepted, Steve. Peter, do you find that if Ari Fleischer were sitting here right now as a spokesman at the White House, or Condoleezza Rice, somebody in authority, and they just listened to Steve Roberts analyze one of the probable reasons for increased danger in the coverage, what would they say?
Well, I think they'd say that it's that Afghanistan is there. If you want to go cover it, fine. We've got our rules, and if you're going to travel with us, I think I'm getting into more of what the Defense Department would say, what the Pentagon would say. If you're going to travel with us, you're going to have to abide by our rules. Today, there was news this morning of this terrible shoot down, apparently, of a helicopter, and another helicopter involved. The first big-time casualties in this war. One casualty, of course, is big time. It was 12 hours before it was reported. It was 12 hours from the time the incident happened until it reported. That's a lifetime in my medium of radio.
But explain, what is it that is going on in the administration's head that puts them in this position to observe journalists with such suspicion, to try to maintain an extraordinary degree of control over American reporters?
It is extraordinary. I don't think it's any different than it has been, the overall philosophy, than it has been in previous administrations.
But what's going on in the administration's mind, maybe in the president's mind? What is the vision of the journalist going out to cover Americans in combat?
Well, their vision is control the story as much as possible. In effect, make Donald Rumsfeld the reporter every day. That's their goal.
Has it worked? Anybody, has it worked?
I think to a certain extent it certainly has.
You got to say some of this goes back to an analysis of what happened in Vietnam, where the people in the government looked at the coverage, and over time the coverage got more and more negative, and they said, therefore, the conclusion is drawn, that's why public support for the Vietnam War began to dissipate, and that is why America had to withdraw under those circumstances. Now, I think there's another way to look at what happened in Vietnam, which is that a lot of the very best reporters on the ground decided at some point or other that the government was lying to them, and that the coverage started to turn at a moment when reporters felt we're not being given a straight story, and a lot of reporters made their name by saying we're going to find that straight story. Whichever one of those views you take, if you're in the administration, you have a great desire for, as long as you can, to control the information so you can maintain support for your policy in the war.
But in Vietnam, what we know is that the turn against the war, which came very late and very little, came when the body count went up and had very little to do with the coverage.
But I think the journalism changed earlier than that, is what I'm saying.
But the journalism didn't really affect the public opinion. It was the body count that did. But we were talking earlier today, Secretary Rumsfeld did have at his press conference, he was asked about this, and he talked about American reporters embedded in a variety of units, in special forces units, on aircraft carriers, and with people landing in situations like the one today. And then he was asked, well, can they report? And he said, eventually. And then we started talking about it, and you said, you can tell us that there is actually such a situation.
We have had, let me say, situations where we have people embedded with a military unit, and you don't hear from them for days until their operation is over, presumably because that an ongoing operation could somehow be jeopardized by information about where somebody is, or when they're there, or how many of them are there, or some other piece of information that could be useful.
I mean, to be fair, that is what is different. Look, the people, you know this better than anybody, Marvin, here, that when you went into World War II reporting, there was censorship. In this situation, you can pick up a satellite phone and be on the air instantly with exactly what's going on. That was never possible before. Vietnam was on film that had to be processed and gotten out of the country and gotten to America or to a satellite, which were few and far between. This is a very, very different situation.
Koki, help us understand, because of your job as the co-anchor of This Week on the Sunday morning interview programs. And I was trying to get from Peter the beginning of an answer here, and maybe you can complete it. How does the administration use the Sunday morning programs in order best to convey its judgment about what the American people are supposed to know?
Well, it definitely does, as did the last administration. They basically have a routine of who we're going to put out this Sunday. And the message that they want to put out on any given Sunday will be determined by them. And then if you want somebody with a big name from the administration, you accept what their message is. This past weekend, they wanted to talk about energy, and nobody else particularly wanted to talk about energy, so there was nobody from the administration on any of the programs, as far as I know. So it is very much something they decide, and ironically, the competition has made it easier for them. Instead of it being, face the nation, meet the press this week, it's now a lot of shows, and there's someplace else to go, and someplace else to be quoted in Monday morning's newspapers, so that it is easier for them to control what's on the air than it used to be when it was just a few shows.
But when I did Meet the Press in the 80s, if the administration gave us the Secretary of Defense, it was on an assumption that that same Secretary of Defense would not appear on another Sunday morning program. But now that does happen.
Right.
Rumsfeld could appear on 2 or 3 programs in a row. Why accept him?
Well, sometimes you don't, but if it's a big week with it's a big story.
I think another difference, Marvin, is
I got you.
another
He's
difference
the only
with
source of information.
with this war is there is no really on-site clearinghouse like Saigon or the Persian Gulf War. It's all coming out of here. It's all coming out of the Pentagon. It's all coming out of command headquarters in Florida, of all places, which couldn't be geographically farther removed from the battle action in Afghanistan. So it's just another keen element of the storyline control that the administration has.
And from another perspective now on the coverage of this war, in the first month or two, we heard practically nothing about collateral damage, practically nothing. In the last month, we have heard nothing but collateral damage, or so it seems. In other words, the accidental killing of Afghan citizens by the U.S. What has changed? Has it been the journalist that has changed, perhaps the access that the journalist has? What is the difference?
As far as I understand, it's the access. I mean, in the early weeks of this conflict, journalists couldn't get anywhere near the action. People were holed up with the Northern Alliance, which was not where the action was, but they were not going out at all, Nick, were they, on the early military operations? What could you see? There was no way to verify anything in terms of collateral damage. Now you can move around much more freely, which leads to more dangerous situations. There was a Canadian journalist today who was severely injured. I'm not sure exactly where she was, but again, trying to, in some fashion, cover what this huge military operation that's going on.
And let's be clear that this Canadian reporter was killed while covering a battle. In other words, the Danny Pearl story
towards the battle.
I'm sorry?
While going down a road towards the area.
Down a road toward the battle, but it wasn't that she was injured, hurt, because she was a reporter. She was simply trying to cover the story.
But she's a reporter. If she was a school teacher, would she be on that road? No. I mean,
no, that's my point.
There is a difference between, Koki was talking about the local journalists who are targeted for the article they wrote last week or the editorial yesterday, and that, where this reprisal is very, very specific to what that journalist did. But Danny Pearl, the 8 journalists who were killed within a matter of a couple of weeks in November in Afghanistan, none of them would have been there if they weren't journalists. And in that sense, they were very much killed because of their jobs.
Something else has changed, I think, and that is the willingness of news outlets to print stories that are critical of the war effort. In the beginning, I think there was a very strong and understandable rally round the flag feeling. There was not a big appetite for critical stories. Walter Isaacson, the head of CNN, publicly said, we are worried about public opinion and not getting too far out of this story, not being too critical. He said it publicly. CNN reporters were told every time they did a story about collateral damage to remind people that this was, the Americans were in Afghanistan because of the tragedy of September 11th. I think 6 months now after September 11th, there's more of a willingness on the part of news organizations to print more critical stories, ones that are more damaging to the administration, and none is more damaging than stories about civilian casualties, which can be used by our enemies.
We will all remember that at the beginning of last year, there were any number of people who were being fired, reporters who were being fired by networks, newspapers, magazines. An unusual number of them were dropped. CNN particularly dropped, in fact, hundreds of people in January and February of last year. Then 9/11 happened, and all of the networks, all of the newspapers went into overdrive and began to cover the war against terrorism at the beginning in a most remarkable, I think from a network point of view, magnificent way. That first week, the 9/11 week, was an extraordinary, in my judgment, an extraordinary performance. And we were told also that no matter how much more money it took to cover the war against terrorism and Afghanistan, we, those of us in positions of authority, were going to lay it out. We were going to pay for it. I had Jerry Levin sitting right here a couple of months ago, and he said no matter what it is going to cost, Time Magazine and CNN will spend that money, period. Okay. Moving right along now to ABC for a moment. ABC also faced the same kind of situation that all of the other news organizations faced. At the beginning, they spent a lot of extra money covering the war. And then there's been a little bit of backing off and a return to where we were probably a year or so ago. And now that the Koppel-Letterman story comes out, we hear that ABC might be losing $140 million either last year or this year, but projecting ahead to lose $400 million. And so please understand that we have to seriously entertain the possibility of losing a major program, offending a major journalist because of the money. And that, it seems to me, is a great case study that we're dealing with right now. Great for your class, and the first one who writes
yours as well.
The first one who writes that case study is going to be doing every journalism student a great favor. But what do we in fact have here now? Is this war going to be covered in the way in which it should be covered, or are people beginning to talk about, again, profits and how much money? What's your sense on it, Steve?
I think that the big important news organizations will continue to spend money and continue to cover the story as it requires. I don't see significant cutbacks that are affecting the coverage on the ground, but I do think we'll pay a price down the line. I think that this, you can't absorb those losses indefinitely. It's, there's an analogy to the government. The president wants to spend $600 billion more on the Pentagon, and he doesn't want to cut his tax bill, and so somewhere down the line there are going to be deficits. Well, news organizations will face deficits too. You can't print the money, and so I do think for the time being we will cover the war and cover it well, but I think news coverage will pay a price down the line because the money's going to have to come from somewhere.
The real problem is not you lovely young people in this room, but your peers. If you watched television, news, if you paid, or your peers paid attention to foreign coverage, if your peers read newspapers, it would be a tremendous difference. But the problem that every news organization has is what they now call news consumers. And news consumers are old people. And old people, in theory, I would like to put the lie to this myself, don't spend money. I personally would like to, get the Congressional Medal of Honor for bringing the economy back. But and that is the fundamental problem. And every year, it used to be that you'd say, okay, people will start paying attention to the news when they buy a house, have kids in school, start really paying property taxes, have to worry about these things. Every survey that's done shows that year after year, the age at which people start to pay attention to news goes up, and the percentage of people in any age bracket that pays attention is smaller than the year before, 2 years before, 5 years before. So that in order to try to get the income to pay for these wildly expensive trips, which they really are when you're talking about sending journalists and crews and satellites and all of that into foreign countries of any kind, but particularly war zones. It's unbelievably expensive. People need to read it. People need to watch it. People need to buy the advertising. And that's the fundamental problem, is people aren't watching.
To the degree that you feel comfortable talking about this, what does this all have to do with ABC right now and Koppel and Letterman? What you just said and explained.
Well, I would like to say to my bosses that you asked me to be on this before any of this happened.
Right.
And I didn't even know till we were at dinner that this was going to be a subject of conversation. But look, it's exactly what I was just saying. According to the newspapers that I've read over the weekend, the advertising revenue for David Letterman, I don't know if it's correct, I've just read it in the papers, is $179 million, and the advertising revenue for Nightline is $73 million. That's $106 million difference. And the reason for the difference is not that Nightline is watched by fewer people, quite the opposite. Nightline is watched by more people. But Letterman is watched by these people, by people who are in the magic age group. And that magic age group is $106 million difference, if the newspapers are correct.
And you have the advantage of not being at a major network right now. And how do you see this?
It's an economic argument that I find mind-boggling. You know, they have the same audience, or you know, there's no significant difference in audience size, but who they are, their age group, you know, and therefore one is, you know, much more the target of the advertisers. The horrible thing is, as you say, Nightline is a wonderful show. It is one of the premier programs in broadcast journalism in America, and the guy who's been there since day one has been, what, humiliated almost by the way this thing has played out.
I don't think Ted Koppel can be humiliated. He's too fine a journalist. He is someone that everybody knows is too much a part of the fabric of this country so that nobody can legitimately humiliate him.
There is a variable here we haven't touched on. Why does it matter that Letterman makes $100 million more? Well, everybody, we do work for profit-making institutions. Let's be under no illusion. We don't work for charitable foundations. So any news organization has got to make money to stay in business. The question is, as you posed at the beginning of the show, how much is enough? And the problem is that so many of these news organizations are run by larger corporations which are concerned about one thing, and that is the price of the stock. CBS is run by a man today named Mel Karmazin, and when he made his money by putting Howard Stern on the radio, and he ran Infinity Broadcasting.
They listened to him.
What?
They listened to him.
They might well listen to him. But when Mel Karmazin became head of CBS News, he said publicly that the most important thing he cared about was the price of CBS stock. Now, if that is the mentality, then there is no room for saying, wait, we will accept $73 million in profit, not $173 million, that we have any room for making judgments based on the public trust, based on news values as opposed to the stock price and profit values. And that seems to me, and you've written about this, Marvin, that seems to me the other key moving piece here, that the people who make the decisions do not have that sense that we're doing something different from selling widgets or simply worrying about the stock price. And that is the other moving part that is squeezing the news business. And that is the people who make the decisions about allocating resources are totally focused on the stock price and the bottom line.
Is there anything, then, that prominent journalists can or should do at this point to bring attention, to bring public attention to what it is that you've just said?
Yes, I do think that it is important to say that we play a special role, and that is, again, I'm not being a Pollyanna here. I think we have to make money, but if you accept that there's a special responsibility for this product and this function in a democracy, then journalists have to say to our bosses, have to say to the public, that you have to be willing to accept something other than maximizing profits. And you know, I'm asked all the time, how can the general public contribute to better journalism? And I have a very simple answer, and that is contribute to your local public radio and television stations, because that is at least one part of the news business, and I plead guilty. I work for them, Koki works for them, and our daughter works for them. But having said that, this is one of the ways in which you have at least one news operation that is at least immunized a bit from these commercial pressures. And that's one of the reasons why public radio has become such an important part of the news business in this country. And AP, too, is largely immunized from these pressures. But CBS isn't, ABC isn't, and NBC is not.
Well, I wanted to go back and, in a sense, turn the question and ask you the following question. It strikes me that we've always been a capitalist country. These have always been profit-making institutions. But we've gone through phases in our form of capitalism where you've had a kind of almost, I think the French would call it hyper-capitalism, where in certain moments the stock price is so much the driving factor that it drives everything out. In other words, market values rule in practically every sphere of life. We've had other times in our history where we have been no less capitalist in the sense that it was a free market economy, but other values jostled with the market values, and we created some sort of compromise. When television started, they didn't even expect news to make a profit. And then you guys were so successful, you made the mistake of starting to make a profit, and then it sort of began to turn this around. And it seems to me it's a question of not of getting...
always expected to make a profit.
That's true. But that you have a jostling of values, and that, I say this, we're all prejudiced on this panel in some ways. I've worked essentially for two public companies that were family-owned newspapers that had a family tradition, and so they want to make a profit, they want the stock price to be good, but the tradition, the journalistic tradition really matters to these two institutions, New York Times and Washington Post. It seemed to me you have, with ABC, CBS, NBC, some really fine journalistic traditions going back a very long way, and the question is, how do those traditions make their values felt as at least a kind of balance to the market values that will always be there?
Now you'll hear a dinner table argument that Steve and I have been having. The truth is, I keep coming back to the problem is the viewer, because we now have this dreadful technology that shows that minute-by-minute ratings. And we know, not after September 11th, but before September 11th, we know that the minute we went abroad, they clicked. And, I mean, at some point...
They clicked, meaning the ratings went down.
They clicked to another channel.
Went to another
Went to another channel, went away. And despite that, we spent tens of millions of dollars having reporters in Congo, having reporters in Bosnia, having reporters in places where people were clicking away because it was the right thing to do. I mean, we are talking about spending $500 million a year on news. So it's not chicken feed. But clearly the Nightline situation has brought us all very much up and made us feel very uncomfortable because we feel so strongly about the value of the program. And just a week or so ago, we were so proud of the fact that Nightline was in Congo and doing those remarkable pieces. So it was one of the many things you could say, look, these are special things we do. I really do not know how you fix the problem of people turning away from what you think is the right thing that they should be watching. You can't tie them to a chair and prop open their eyes and make them watch it.
You can't, but there's another element here, which I think Steve was talking about before, which has to do with the management of a corporation.
But what I'm saying is the management has allowed, I mean, we have sent people into Congo, we have sent people into these places at a great expense, and the clicker comes out.
Right, and I remember a story, because I was sitting there when it happened, of Bill Paley, owner at CBS, in the early 60s, sitting around with the foreign correspondents and ticking off for all of us the great and wonderful things that would happen next year. And Charlie Collingwood stood up and said, but Bill, that's going to cost you a lot of money. And Paley's answer I will never forget, which was, you guys cover the news, I've got Jack Benny to make money for me. And at that time, it was possible for somebody at the very top to say, news is a lost leader. News may make some money for us, but not a lot. Big argument now over Nightline is whether it is making or losing $13 million a year. 15, 20 years ago, it made $70 million a year. Then it was wonderful. But what I'm getting at is that Paley had in mind that he could take all of the profit that he got, or a part of the profit he got from Jack Benny, and give it to news.
But Marvin,
and we did very well.
Marvin, this week we were just at Howard K. Smith's memorial
yes,
service.
Indeed.
And it was very clear that at one point Bill Paley said, I can't lose affiliates.
That's right.
And I can't lose those Southern affiliates no matter what the news is. So everybody has a price. It
was not what the news is, it was the way Howard wanted to say it. It was an editorial comment. But you're absolutely right. He didn't want to lose any affiliate stations. But where does this leave us? Where does this leave us at this point? I mean, supposing it does happen, that for all of the reasons, whether it be the kind of management at a corporation, at a network, whether it be young people who aren't watching news as much as they should be, quote unquote, where does that leave us at this point? Are we watching the people who are taking advantage of the public airwaves, simply capitalizing on it in this way? Is there nothing? I'm trying to get back to my same question, because I think in the way in which it's being answered, there is the larger answer, which is there's nothing we can do about it. That it's just going to go on in this way. That if Ted Koppel, you say not humiliated, I believe he is. If Nightline could even be considered as a target for being dropped, what other program is safe? How is news, in the way in which I think all of us would like to see it, how is it protected? Come on, give us a column.
Well, yeah, first of all, the fact that we were talking about this, the fact that day after day after day, this has been a front page story in a lot of newspapers, and maybe even been covered some on television, sends a signal to the management of this company. I mean, companies respond to profit. They also respond to their own public images. And I'd be very curious what ABC top management outside the news department is sort of kicking around among themselves, because I suspect, yes, but I suspect that they have to take into account what image this creates for ABC News, and that becomes, that is a whole lot of people out there standing up for a certain set of values that say, yes, we understand you got to make money, but there are other values out there. This happens to be a valuable television program. The other question I've had is, what if they do make this switch, or what happens at CBS? I mean, there is an opening. It would be a pretty nifty trick if CBS turned around and invented a news program for that hour. I mean,
but all of
but it would. I wonder what would happen to their audience if they actually did that.
The people who run the networks are not foolish people, and I don't even think they're evil people. But there are people who are driven by an absolute desire to maximize profit and the public interest somehow or another not be damned, but not necessarily be put up front.
There are three things. One is, I agree with EJ, that there is a role for public commentary and criticism of these institutions. Perhaps they will respond. I'm not optimistic. Secondly, there is a dwindling but still very important form of ownership, which EJ mentioned, and that is the family-owned corporation, or the Bill Paley type. Katharine Graham, before she died, did a terrific piece for the Wall Street Journal in which she talked about this, and she said that we can accept 10 or 12% profit, whereas last year, the editor of the San Jose Mercury News quit, saying they are trying to force me to produce 22% profit in order to satisfy 6 young people in Wall Street who are the 6 people who evaluate media stocks for the 6 big companies. Now, what's the difference between 22% and 12%? The 10% is the public trust. The 10% is the money that goes into news coverage, which doesn't necessarily profit the bottom line. But unfortunately, and I don't know how to reverse this, unfortunately, the decline of the family-owned newspaper or news organization that does consider this a public trust, which is willing to accept what the Graham and Sulzberger families is, which is a lower profit margin, and pour some of that money back into the news gathering, very few. But I do come back to public broadcasting. I do think that we are reminded again that this is a way to immunize at least one news organization from commercial pressure.
Just parenthetically, their stock has actually done very well over a long period of time, too.
The Post.
I mean, these
no question about that.
Go ahead. I think this whole Koppel-Letterman debate has almost fueled into the public arena the sort of whispered debate that's been going on among broadcast journalists for a long time. Which one of the three networks is going to be the first one to turn out the lights on the nightly newscast? And that's the big fear now among my colleagues is, and it's one of the first things that came up. I was on the road with Bush last week when the Koppel-Letterman story first started to simmer, and a lot of people were saying, well, is this going to be it? Is this going to be the thing that opens the door to to signing off one of the major networks?
Look, how many cities used to have 5, 6, 7 newspapers and now have one? But do we have more information and more news than we've ever had before in human history? Absolutely. We have so many outlets that are now national outlets, both newspapers. I mean, it used to be, when Steve and I lived in Los Angeles and he was working for the New York Times, you couldn't get the New York Times in Los Angeles. You can get it anywhere in the country today, probably a lot of places in the world. Wall Street Journal, USA Today. Let's look at CNN, MSNBC, C-SPAN, CNBC, the numbers of outlets on television, as well as the public and broadcast outlets, broadcast networks. Radio outlets, internet outlets, I mean, magazine specialties. If you want information, there's more information than anybody can possibly process in the course of a day. Does that mean that we're not going through a period where some of this is shaking down? Of course we are. And if you're a broadcast executive, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but I can certainly understand it, and you're looking and you see in your view, 3 networks doing exactly the same thing. When you've already moved into a world of ESPN covering sports, and Nickelodeon has already taken away all the children's programming from the networks, and Lifetime broadcast to women. Now, don't you say, let's have specialty outlets for news and for certain kinds of entertainment, and the same way that radio stations are broadcast to niche audiences. Maybe that's the wave of the future.
Well, it may very well be the wave of the future, but you're giving us, forgive me, Koki, the exact same explanation that was provided by Jerry Levin a couple of months ago, that we have a great deal more information.
We do.
What about the quality of the information that we have? That is not addressed. It is addressed in quantitative, but not in qualitative terms. Anyway, that's it for this edition of the Kalb Report. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I want to thank C-SPAN for being here and spreading this message. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the National Press Club, the George Washington University, and the Shorenstein Center up at Harvard for joining me in this effort. I want to thank the Knight Foundation, and finally, thanks to our panelists for being so thoughtful and so provocative and really coming through, and I thank them all very, very much. I'm Marvin Kalb. Good night and good luck.